Good evening. This is Michael Blaze, and you're viewing and listening to Echoes of Blackness. Echoes of Blackness was created in order to give an opportunity to the many positive people in the Black movement from the 60s to now, and even earlier than that, an opportunity to express themselves. So tonight, we are very honored in the studio to have Robert Lee Johnson, a fantastic author. We're going to discuss both of his books, his current book and his book soon to come. He was the co-chairman of the Project Committee? He was the chairman at one time of the Project Committee of CAM, the co-chairman of the Compton branch of the Black Panthers, something we'll touch upon a little later on, and a founding member of the Coalition Against Police Abuse. So it's going to be an exciting hour. We look forward to a lot of education. This is sort of a historical piece by nature of who he is and what he believes in. So, Robert, start us off by telling us the name of your current book and publication and the Arcadia connection and so on.
Okay, my current book is published by Arcadia Publishers. It is called Images of America, Compton. And what we've done with this, with that project is we've taken antique photographs and we use those photographs in an effort to tell the story, the true history of the city of Compton, which of course has been, set to myth and a lot of misunderstanding because people just don't, a lot of people just don't know the history of California, let alone of Southern California and how these cities grew, where they came from. You know, what is the actual history? I take it all the way back from the Dominguez Land Grant up to the 1970s. The land grant was in the late 1800s. So what we're looking at is when, the city of Los Angeles was actually founded in 1781. And what happened was the Spanish crown wanted the conquistadors, the explorers of that time, to actually settle the area. Spain was looking at encroachment on California from the British and the Russians. You know, if you go up north, you go to Northern California, you see Russian River. That's because the Russians were up there fur trapping and everything. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of countries who were kind of envious. You know, they wanted to have California as a possession. Mm-hmm. And this was before the gold rush and everything. It was just the location, the weather, and very fertile land.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you say very fertile land, I thought we were in a desert.
Well, Southern California, we're semi-arid. Mm-hmm. Now, the great thing about the city of Compton is that the original settlers who came in about 1867, they had been 49ers. They called them failed 49ers. They didn't get rich on gold or anything, but they were essentially farmers from the Midwest. So what they decided to do was, and you got to remember, this was a Methodist agricultural collective. Okay, it was their church, but they were a bunch of farmers. They bought the land, which had been sold at auction, and I have to get into that because this is part of a whole scheme to basically get the land from the Californios and put it into the hands of the Americans after the American conquest. So in 1867, there's a piece of the Dominguez Land Grant that had gone up for auction. And it was called the Gibson Temple Tract because those were the investors who bought that. They bought the land from Gibson and Temple and basically sight unseen came down from Stockton because they had been living in Stockton. And, crazy as it was, they came in December of 1867. It was raining cats and dogs. They had bought this land and they set up some, lean-to some very rudimentary structures. Well, it starts raining and everything floods. Okay, we just got through talking about it was a desert. Well, their problem was everything flooded. So they actually had to, this was about 30 families, including G.D. Compton, Morton, and other people. They fell back to an area that's now Central Avenue and Alondra, because it sits on high ground. And a lot of the people were willing to give up. They were just, you know what, they were about to mutiny. So what ends up happening
Give me my money back, huh?
Exactly. And these people had, and you're right, they had bought, some of them bought 40-acre lots, some of them bought 80-acre lots. Mm-hmm. And they said, all this stuff is underwater. So, and you have to think about those times. There's no general store. Okay, closest general store is downtown Los Angeles, which is a day's ride. Mm-hmm. Okay, the other one would be in Wilmington, which is another day's ride. So they're really not happening with GD Compton. Matter of fact, I'm sure they played with those initials a little bit. So, but he convinced them to stay, and the waters receded. They planted their crops. And in their very first harvest, most of those farmers were able to pay off because were able to pay off their mortgages because the harvest was so abundant. Turns out that, and a lot of people forget this, the Southeast County, all these cities, Compton, Linwood, Maywood, everything right down the Los Angeles River, it's on a delta. For eons, the Los Angeles River, what we call the Los Angeles River now, would overflow its banks and put, topsoil, silt. So it made that area very, very fertile. You talk to anyone who grew up in Compton today, and they will tell you about the fruit trees in their backyards. Okay, I grew up with so many different fruit trees, it wasn't funny. Okay, we had everything from avocados, peaches. My family moved from Watts to Compton in 1961. I didn't know what a loquat was until I moved to Compton and had a loquat tree. Okay, so grapefruits. I mean, my backyard was full of fruits. We didn't have to go to the store. We just went in the back of persimmons. I didn't know what a persimmon was until I'm in Compton, got a persimmon tree. Mm-hmm. We had banana trees with sweet bananas. So the whole thing was these farmers, and it starts off as an agricultural community. These farmers basically found themselves in paradise, especially if you compare it to where they came from in the Midwest, where they were trying to bust sod on the plains.
Yeah. So now we'll come up a little bit, and you sort of mentioned something about scheming to get property and land and so on. Can we touch upon that?
Well, like I was saying, the city of Los Angeles was founded in 1781. You look on the police cars or on their stationery, cities founded 1781. So we know what was going on in the United States in 1781. There was no United States yet, okay? Black people were enslaved. Well, just as, and I'll use my family as an example, my maternal grandfather was on the railroad, and in order to get away from Jim Crow, okay, he was in New Orleans, he didn't want to raise his family under Jim Crow, so he moved his family out of the South, basically ended up coming to Los Angeles. Well, in those days, Mexico had a caste system. So if you were of African descent, you were on the bottom rung of the caste system. So just as in a future generation, black people would move to get away from Jim Crow, when they had an opportunity in Mexico to get away from the caste system, these people took it. So that's why over half of the original settlers of the city of Los Angeles are of African descent. One thing I always tell people to do is...
Does that include Biddy Mason?
Well, Biddy Mason came later, and she has her own unique story.
Let me know when we get there. I love her.
Okay. Well, just remind, we're not going to get by that because that's a really key story in the history of Los Angeles. But when we're looking at the Afro Hispanics, okay, who came up, we're looking at families like the Tapias, the Picos. These were were, well, we look at the Pico brothers, for instance. They had become huge landowners, and you have to remember most of the people who got land grants, they were soldiers beforehand. Spain Spain wasn't sending out a check every month or every week to their soldiers. Sometimes, they got paid very little. They had to come up with their own uniforms a lot of times. So at the end of their service, the Spanish government worked out a program so that they could receive land for their service to the crown. So, for instance, when we look at, we'll take the Pico family, for instance. Pio Pico's father, Jose Maria Pico, was a soldier, like his father, Santiago Pico, who came to California in one of the expeditions in 1769. Okay. Anyway, so these soldiers, of course, at the end of their life for their retirement, they petitioned and asked for a land grant. And usually it was their commanding officers who moved into civilian offices like governor who would okay those land grants. We drive up and down Pico Boulevard, and most of us never realize that Pico Boulevard is named after a black man. They'll see our history will be put right in front of us, but if we don't find out about it, we don't know. We'll have no idea.
The Pico brothers were
Pio and Andreas Pico. They were some of the largest landowners in California. Okay, they owned most of the San Fernando Valley. They owned Mission Viejo, Santa Margarita, which is Rancho Santa Margarita, encompasses Camp Pendleton, National City. I mean, that was a huge land grant, 177,000 acres. Andreas Pico also owned parts of La Habra, Temecula. They had property in Santa Clarita and parts further north. So they owned huge tracts of land. The area that we call Whittier and Pico Rivera were part of Pio Pico's El Ranchito that he had out there. Right, if you go today, right off of the 605 and Whittier Boulevard, you'll see the Pico Mansion, and I think everybody should go out there and kind of take a look. They've done a pretty good job on reconstructing it, and just to get an idea of where he lived and some of the things that happened to, the state of California because of the Pico brothers. Atlantic Richfield is the precursor to Arco. Well, the Pico brothers were the main investors of the forerunner to Atlantic Richfield. If you go up to Santa Clarita, you'll see Pico Canyon. Well, they pump oil out of there. And, of course, there's a reason why it's called Pico Canyon.
Damn. So let's come back a little closer to Compton, though. Or is this all connected from Compton? And I think some of the settlers were like in downtown Los Angeles at the same time. Was that same period of time?
Well, what ends up happening is we have the Mexican-American War, the American conquest. And one of the things that when the Americans got here is they saw all these brown people of various hues who owned all this land. And one of the first senators was a senator named William Gwynn. California's first two senators was William Gwynn and John Fremont. So William Gwynn basically said, look, if we don't figure out a way to break up these land grants, we're not going to have land for the Americans. So he was deliberately trying to figure out a way to circumvent the Treaty of Cahuenga. That treaty ended hostilities in California. It was signed by the last military leader Mexican military leader in California, which was Andreas Pico. This was during the time when his brother, Pio Pico, was governor. So Andreas signs this peace treaty with Fremont, and the peace treaty essentially says that the people can keep their land and keep their language. Well, by 1850, that's a stumbling block, because now you have you have the 49ers, the gold rush, and everything, and so the people who didn't make their money doing the gold rush, well, they were basically farmers, and they were looking for land. Usually, an American plot of land wasn't any more than 100 acres. And they're seeing people with 177,000 acres or 144 acres over here. So they were saying, it's like one family, we need to break this up. So they came up with the United States Land Commission. So they said, yeah, your treaty says you can keep the land, but what we want you to do is prove you own the land. Okay? So in order to prove that you own the land, it took lawyers, surveyors.
Breaking.
Yes. They kept people in court. You litigated. Now, there was another way also. In California, before the Americans came, you paid your taxes at harvest time. Okay? When the Americans get it, the same way we pay taxes now in the springtime. Well, if you're a farmer, okay, you're land rich, but you're cash poor. So these large landowners had to go to money lenders. And keep in mind, most of these people did not know the language or the laws of the United States. They had been basically just a couple of years before in another country. And they were the landed gentry. And now they're looked down on as to quote Kit Carson, niggers and greasers. Okay, that was, they were like, what? Because a lot of them looked at themselves as akin to European nobility, and they looked for that. There was no black consciousness program going on. They saw themselves as the equivalent of European nobility, and so for that to be pulled, that rug was just pulled out from under them. And so they were actually fighting for their very heritage, of the land. A lot of them, and you see between 1850, by the 1880s, most of those land grants were broken up and gone. The city of Oakland was the Ranchero San Antonio, okay? And it was owned by the Peralta family. The only thing they have left now is a street. Okay, so you had some of the few land grants that stayed partially intact. I'll give you an example, was the Dominguez land grant where the city of Compton was part of. The Dominguez land grant, what happened with Manuel Dominguez was he was obsessed with trying to keep his land grant together. So he bought out his relatives, his brothers and sisters, and as many as he could who he thought would squander the land, and he tried to maintain that. The only time he actually sold land was when he was forced to. Like, for instance, he was forced to sell to Banning, and that's how the city of Wilmington came about. He was not happy about that. But what he did was he saw the writing on the wall early after the American conquest and saw what was going on. His sons had died before they had heirs. So he had his daughters. And anybody living out in Carson knows Susanna Road, Victoria Park, Dolores Dominguez Watson of the Watson Land Company, of course, the Carson Land Companies. Manuel Dominguez purposely had his daughters marry white men in order for the family to be able to keep the land. And that's why that's one of the land grants. I mean, even today, their descendants still control a lot of land. Matter of fact, I was doing some research, and in the 20s, they discovered oil on the land. And a couple of years ago, I can't think if it was 2013 or so, No, I take that back. I look back on it was actually 2003. It was a little while back. The family received over $53 million in royalty from the oil that was pumped out of that land. So, they're still making money on that. You still see the Carson Land Company, the Watson Land Company, and they're still doing business based on that land grant from all those years ago.
Let me just chime in for a moment and remind people that this is Echoes of Blackness that you're listening to, and our special guest, as you can tell, local historian also, Robert Lee Johnson, and we're discussing, what are we discussing?
I guess some of the history of Southern California.
All right, and we went to the history of Southern California. And his book talks about Compton, but it's all linked together because of certain conspiracies and things that happen with like water or land, or how did that all come together?
Well, Compton, as we were describing the Dominguez land grant, the northeast portion of the Dominguez land grant was given to Manuel Dominguez's favorite niece. And I always hear two stories. One, that Manuel Dominguez owned that land and gave it to his favorite niece. And then another story I heard was that actually her mother owned that land. She was a sister of Manuel, and she gave the land to her daughter as a wedding present. She married a Ferrer. Anyway, this happened in the 1850s. She took out a loan, and by 1866, I believe she took out a loan for about $1,000. This was 4,600 acres. By 1866, she loses the land to foreclosure, and the investors, two investors, Gibson and Temple, buy the land at auction. Okay, it's a sheriff's sale, and they buy the land, and then the land is sold. The investors sell the land to an agricultural collective that was headed by Griffith Dickerson Compton. He's representing about 30 families. They come down from Stockton, and I described what happened. They came in December, kind of the wrong time. But Compton, the land is extremely fertile. So they're loving it. Compton, up into the 20s and 30s, Compton, when they would have the Los Angeles County Fair, the farmers from Compton won the best livestock, the best produce. They were always number one, number two, simply because of how fertile the area is. Mm-hmm. As the city of Compton develops, it becomes a city in 1888. It's incorporated. One of the first things they do is they build schools and they build a church right on Compton Boulevard and Willowbrook, where the post office sits today, set the original Methodist church that the original colonists built. And
your book has many images of these things you're speaking about?
Yes, it
does.
does.
From way back then?
Yes, it does. It has that first church, and I believe the first reverend there was Reverend McCool. So that is all these photographs are in the book. Compton was
Tell us about that gentleman also that was surrounded by a number of people. You said he was the first black mayor. Only reason I'm doing it, I gave you a lot of time, but we're also going to have to touch about some other things. But I sort of want to, you can finish what you're saying, but then I want to come up to what distinguished Compton in the eyes of all of Los Angeles in 1969.
Oh, okay.
So.
Well, I'll jump right to that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Compton gets established. It's known for its schools and its housing. But also by the you have a population explosion after World War II. Mm-hmm. A lot of veterans coming back. It's the story of Southern California. Veterans bring their family here. Mm-hmm. Some of the soldiers had been coming through, going to the Pacific. They like the weather. They come back. One of them included George Bush, who actually lived in Compton in 1949 and 1950. He lived on Santa Fe Boulevard. Got a picture in the book of little Georgie with his cowboy hat and his pistol. So there's a picture in there. But just like
name your book one more time.
Images of America, Compton.
And where can people get it? You
can get it at Barnes & Nobles. You can get it on Amazon. And, of course, if you're local here in Los Angeles, go to Esselwan bookstores, please.
All right, so back to the municipality.
So here you have this community that has been around for quite some time now. After World War II, you have an influx of people. You have more building. The farms are starting to go away, light manufacturing, and it becomes a bedroom community. Mm-hmm. And just like most of the bedroom communities in Southern California, they had racially restrictive covenants. Compton, like Inglewood and Southgate and some of the other surrounding cities, like Linwood, were radically white. I like to call them angrily white people. They were not interested in having any black people living there. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you're familiar, but in the 50s, there was a white teenage gang called the Spook Hunters. So if you were caught in the wrong community, if you were in Inglewood or you were in Compton or Linwood or Southgate, and if you happened to go into the wrong neighborhood in Highland Park, you might have run into the future chief of police, Daryl Gates, who was in one of those gangs, who specifically targeted non-whites to keep them out of the community. So if you didn't run into the Spook Hunters and the police didn't get you, okay, you call that a lucky day. Mm-hmm. Because, familiar, you would get like, what are you doing here? Where are you going? Mm-hmm. But the thing about Compton is that Compton sits at Rosecrans and Central Avenue. The black community in Los Angeles has historic roots that originally started at 5th and Central. Over the years, it starts moving south. So you're at 12th and Central. By, soon in the 20s, you're at 41st and Central, Dunbar Hotel area, things like that. You go down a little further, by the 1950s, you're at 103rd and Central. And a lot of these were red car stops, okay?
What is that?
The red car. The red car. You used to be able to hop on there, for a nickel. You could go all over Southern California.
Somebody told me the only place you could be buried was way over there near Whittier, and you had to take that, the burial ride on that car.
Yeah,
which
actually,
I thought was deep.
Yeah, actually, that was in Santa Fe Springs, right off of Florence. Mm-hmm. That cemetery is there where they would bury black people. You're
Isn't
right.
that deep?
Yeah. So as the black community is moving down Central Avenue, it's only a matter of time before you're at Central and Rosecrans. Mm-hmm. Now, in Compton, these were basically World War II veterans, people who were buying their homes and raising their family, and they looked on the black community coming towards their community as a threat. And keep in mind also, I don't know if you know the theology of the Mormon church, but Compton was a heavily Mormon community. Mm. Okay, and in those days, this is before 1977, 78, when I guess God changed his mind in their point of view and said, yes, black people do have souls. Because before that, we didn't have souls. We were like cats and dogs, according to Mormon theology. Mm-hmm. So they were not very interested in having us as neighbors. Matter of fact, Compton had set up a Keep the Negroes North of 130th. There was a whole campaign for that. But you also had black people who had gone to World War II, and they fought just like everyone else, even though they were in segregated units. Mm-hmm. And they were not interested in coming home to the same old stuff. And when we look at some of the pioneers of the civil rights movement of that era, because the civil rights movement did not start in the 50s. Mm-hmm. This is something that had been going on before Frederick Douglass, Denmark Vesey. There was always a movement for freedom. Yeah. Okay, but build on that movement. It was re-energized after World War II. You know, it's like, wait a minute, we're fighting fascism over here in Europe. Okay, we're freeing Jewish people from these prison camps, but now we're coming home to lynching, forced sterilization, and police brutality. We're not having it, and that change of attitude really re-energized that whole movement. You also had people, again, coming back from, like my father, coming back from Korea, you know, where they were finally just starting to integrate the troops. They were starting to end the segregated troops. My father actually fought in a segregated unit in Korea. But so these people were very racially aware. And one of the things that we saw was that as people tried to get into positions of power politically, running for office, it was with most of the time it was with the idea of bettering the community, of doing something to further the rights of the black people in the community. So as we get into Compton, they run into a wall of racism. There was an incident with the Jackson family who moves into a Compton neighborhood, and they're met by a mob. Well, Mr. Jackson comes out with a shotgun and his 245s and explains to them why it's not wise for them to be on his lawn. And they backed off. He could not count on the police to help him. He had to practice self-defense. Eventually, the west side of Compton starts to become, well, actually becomes all black by a certain time. And one of the things that happened was, are you familiar with the term blockbusting?
No.
Okay. Blockbusting is a real estate term, and it was used in Compton. I think, like I was telling you, my family came from, we moved from Watts to Compton in 1961, as a lot of other people did. This was a time when black people could own their homes, and a lot of people were no longer interested in renting. They wanted to own something, and they were able to do that in Compton. Realtors went to white people who were living in Compton and basically said, look, you need to list your home with me right now because the Negroes are coming, and 6 months from now, you're going to still want to move, but you're not going to be able to get the price for your house that you can get today. And so, of course, the people were frightened. The Negroes are coming. I've only seen one of two of them on television. So, but I don't want them as neighbors. So they used fear. They took that same listing and would go to the black community and say, I have a willing seller. And you have to remember, this is right after restrictive covenants were ruled unenforceable. So this was new. So what happens in Compton, especially in the early 60s, because you already had some black people who had moved in the 50s, here and there. But by the early 60s, almost overnight, whole neighborhoods that were majority white became majority black. When my family moved in, we moved to our house on Cedar Street in October 1961. And as a kid, I'm looking down the street, and I'm a kid, so your lens cap is on. I'm looking down the street, and all I knew was I was told it was moving day. Pack my little stuff so we could move to our new house. Well, when I get there, I'm sitting in the car and I'm looking down the street, and all down the street I could see everybody moving. So as a kid, I'm thinking, it's moving day, so everybody's moving. Okay? If you could imagine for these white people who had put everything into buying this home, and then watching their neighborhoods change almost overnight, it was pretty frightening to them. And of course, unfortunately, in this society, fear and racism tend to go hand in hand. So the realtors and the banks made money hand over fist. But what they did was they actually destroyed any kind of community that could have happened between the two groups. It automatically set up something that would set up the animosity. So West Compton quickly becomes mostly black, while East Compton is still mostly white up until the 70s. You had black people who were moving into East Compton because you could not go across Alameda Street, okay? So as black people started moving into East Compton, they were still burning crosses in the 70s on people's lawns. But that was basically set up by the real estate industry and the banking industry. Like I said, they came out like fat rats in a cheese factory. But what it also set up was, we talk about predatory lending today. Most of these people were first-time home buyers. So, of course, when you're setting up a loan, they did not get the best loans. They got the most high-priced loans. And most of those loans had balloon payments on them that were due in 10 years. So one thing that a lot of people started noticing is by the early 1970s, these homeowners were losing their homes because these balloon payments came due and they couldn't refinance and they couldn't pay off the balloon payments. So the investors who were holding the seconds on those homes foreclosed, and they didn't come back to live in those homes. Most of them were white investors. They weren't going to live there. But they put renters there. So what you started doing was you were changing the community from a community of homeowners. Okay, it starts off as black middle-class homeowners, and now you're bringing in renters. Mm-hmm. You're changing the complexion of the community economically, not just in skin tone. Mm-hmm. Okay, so by the 70s, you also have another phenomenon. White flight. Okay, we all know about the '65 rebellion, which made a really white panic. It was like, how quickly can I get out of here? Anybody who lived in Compton during that time of the early 60s remembers Park Village, which was a white enclave right in West Compton. It was surplus World War II housing that the tenants basically bought as surplus from the government and formed their own homeowners association, and they basically tried to keep it as white as possible for as long as possible. And there was a big brick fence all the way around it. And if you were black, you were challenged about going in there for quite some time. Matter of fact, when we first moved to Compton, that was the first thing we were told: don't go into Park Village. Anyway, after '65, I said these people were trying to get out of there. It's like that scared the hell out of a lot of people. So what ends up happening is when you look at the small cities like Compton, Linwood, all these cities, most of the merchants live in the city. So when you had white flight, those businessmen who had those businesses on Compton Boulevard or in the area, when they left, they took those businesses with them. So again, anyone remembering downtown Compton in the late 70s, early 80s, downtown Compton was virtually a ghost town. Mm-hmm. So you lose your homeowner base, you lose your tax base. Compton did not have a huge manufacturing base. Okay, that was something that the city fathers early on had said, we want to be a bedroom community. But once Compton has a black administration, and we'll talk about Mayor Dollarhide being elected the first black mayor of Compton. He was actually the first black mayor of a major municipality west of the Mississippi. And I always equate Compton to Haiti. Okay, Haiti was the jewel of the French Empire. Okay, it was the richest colony that the French had. But when those Africans jumped up and said, we're not going to be slaves no more, and ran the French out, Toussaint Louverture, and you say, okay, we're running the French out, and they fought off the British and scared the hell out of the American slave owners, mm-hmm. They were going to punish Haiti. And Haiti's been being punished ever since. Haiti had to pay reparations. I know for a fact they paid reparations through from 1802, 1804 through World War II. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're not paying something now. We have to, we look at after this earthquake, and how many years ago was that? And the people are still living in tents. There's something twisted going on.
Always has been.
Haiti has been stigmatized because they threw off the slave owners. Compton has always been stigmatized for similar reasons. Compton had the first black mayor, the first black administration of a city, in California post 1850. When Mayor Dollarhide won the election, if you look at some of the headlines, one of the headlines, they weren't saying congratulations, Douglas Dollarhide, for being mayor. It said Dollarhide wins, Negro experiment in self-government. The idea was, of course, it's like, well, not only can they not be quarterbacks, they probably wouldn't be good managers, but what the hell are they doing trying to run a city? Mm-hmm. And that's when you started seeing all of the negative media around the city. As I grew up in the city, you would hardly ever see Compton in the news, before Dollarhide was mayor. After Dollarhide was mayor, spotlight was on Compton and was always for something negative. To this day, the surrounding cities, Gardena and Paramount, Compton Boulevard used to run through those cities. Compton Boulevard would run down to the beach, and it would run, and it also ran east. Well, those cities voted to change the name of Compton Boulevard to the east. Now it's called Somerset. Gardena changed the name to Marine. Nader's Furniture Store said they're on Marine Street now, would have been on Compton Boulevard. They said, no, we don't want that. Let's change the name. So that city's been stigmatized. Part of being stigmatized like that means that some people try to take advantage of you because it's perceived black city. When the city of Compton said, look, we know that we need to annex some areas around, in this area that are unincorporated so we can start to develop a manufacturing base. Well, the county committee that looked to when cities want to annex something said no to Compton every time, and it was extremely racial. The idea was, just like you hear some of these fools talking about that when Barack Obama got elected, that they want him to fail. Well, when you had a black administration in the city of Compton, they wanted it to fail. Now, I was going to just say this. With all that going on, now you add the crack epidemic. You get to the 1980s, and Ronald Reagan's foreign policy in South America leads to a flood of cocaine into the community. That sets up, basically, you saw Eduardo, what's his name, Blandone. They talk about Freeway, Ricky Ross, and in Compton there was a guy named Kenneth Turtle Johnson. These were the big cocaine dealers that worked with the Contras. They flooded the communities with cheap cocaine and virtually destroyed those communities. And as a byproduct of that, these gangsters looked at the gang network, and they saw it as a natural drug distribution network. And they exploited these apolitical kids, Now, if you put drugs and money and guns together, you end up with a low-level guerrilla war. And that's what we saw on the streets in Compton, Inglewood, and other cities, where black youth were killing each other over this perceived wealth. That was set up. We could thank Ronald Reagan for that.
We're running low on time. And again, this is Michael Blaze, and you're listening to Echoes of Blackness. And I've been sitting here, as you probably have also, listening to author and historian and former Black Panther, Robert Lee Johnson, taking us back in history, and our people in the back, Jeremy's been putting up a lot of slides and allow people to take a look at it. Before we talk about a few other things, once again, the name of your book, where people can get it, and what's in it.
Okay. Again, the book is called Images of America, Compton. Basically, we have antique photographs that are captioned to show the history, the progression of the city of Compton. In that book, it goes up until about the 1970s, maybe early 80s. The book can be purchased at Barnes & Noble's, Amazon.com, and of course, if you're local, please go to SO1 Bookstore.
Yeah, Lamert Park.
In Lamert Park. Tell James you said hello.
You know, you also have another book coming up. Our time is really gone away. You'll have to come back again soon. But let's speak about your other book, which also is sort of like the local historian thing, or what? The name. Yeah,
the new book, which will be published by the History Press later this year, is called Notable Southern Californians in Black History.
Ooh.
One of the things that I've noticed over the years is that, see, if we don't know where we came from and the struggles that were involved to get us here today, then we get disconnected and we get lost. I think you asked me earlier about Biddy Mason.
Oh, yeah.
And Biddy Mason basically walked from Mississippi to Salt Lake City, from Salt Lake City to San Bernardino, okay, as a slave. She was brought here by Robert Smith, who was her slave owner, her and her sister Hannah, and her children, who were by the slave owner. Bridget Mason, I like to say Bridget Mason because Biddy actually means, and everybody calls her Biddy Mason, but Biddy, if you look it up, it actually means servant girl. Her name was Bridget Mason. And so when she gets here, she's in San Bernardino at the Mormon stockade with her family. There were about 14 other slaves there. And she had been brought to California by her Mormon master. And a free black man named Robert Owens, who had an army contract to supply wood and water. He also had a contract with the Mormons to supply wood for them. His son falls in love with her daughter. And they're saying, look, you're in California. We don't have to be slaves here. So as soon as the master finds out about that, what he decides to do, he says, well, look, I'm shortening the story, but he's saying, look, you could be just as free in Texas. Okay, and this is in the early 1850s, just before Dred Scott. Because if it had happened after Dred Scott, she would have still been a slave. Because what ends up happening, the slave owner takes them to a Mormon camp up in the Santa Monica Mountains to hide them out until Hannah, Bridget's sister, who was pregnant by him, wasn't able to travel. So they were waiting for her to have her baby before they moved to Texas. So he hides them in a Mormon camp up in the Santa Monica Mountains. Robert Owens, who had, now it's Owens Canyon, they used to call it Nigger Canyon, okay, up in the San Gabriel Mountains. And that's where he would get his wood and everything that he sold to everybody. And he also bought land. He was a landowner. Anyway, so since he was influential, he was able to talk to the sheriff, and he formed a posse of his own vaqueros, okay, black and brown cowboys that he had working for him and his son. And they went to go find his son's woman. So they rode up to the camp in Santa Monica and basically rescued them. The sheriff put everybody under arrest in protective custody, and they went to court in Santa Monica. Judge Benjamin Hayes, who had been an abolitionist in Massachusetts, happened to be on the bench. And since there was a law, you remember we were talking about William Gwynn, the senator?
Oh, yes.
Okay, well, one of the first things William Gwynn put forth as a law was that black people could not testify against a white person in court. Makes that real handy when you're grabbing people's land. Okay, so this is again before Dred.
That's a hell of a law, but go ahead.
Oh yeah. Believe me, there are a few other ones. Anyway, so Bridget Mason could not testify against her slave owner in open court, but she was able to be brought into the judge's chambers, and he asked her some questions. Well, after the judge asked her master a few questions, he was trying to say, well, they're not my slaves, they're my traveling companions. Mm-hmm. And, of course, that didn't fly very well. So what ends up happening is there's another court date set, and Robert Smith, the slave owner, doesn't show up. He's loses by default. Mm-hmm. Bridget Mason ends up working for a doctor, and because one of the things that she happened to be, even though at the time she was illiterate, but she was well versed in herbology. She ends up working as a nurse. She becomes famous during the smallpox epidemic because she's the only one who would go into the county prisons and help the people who were suffering. She also saved up her money and bought parcels in what we know now as downtown Los Angeles, and was able to make a relative fortune during that time. She was well known for her generous attitude. Matter of fact, during one of the floods, she set up accounts for people who were destitute, and she paid for it. She set it up at a local grocery and just basically said, people who need food, get it for them, I'll pay for it. So she was also one of the founders of First AME Church.
Reverend Cecil Mary.
That's right. She was one of the founders. That church was actually founded in her living room. Now, in my new book, I also have John Ballard, who was also a founder of First of Fame Church. He's in there. He had 160 acres right above Malibu. It was a place they used to call Niggerhead Mountain. Now it's called Ballard Mountain. I have Nathan Harrison, who lived on Mount Palomar, and he lived right by, now it's called Nathan Harrison Grade. It used to be called Nigger Nate Grade. See, one way, if you want to find out where black people were in earlier times, look to see what they called the place. In Carson, where they're talking about putting a stadium today, it used to be called Nigger Sloosh, because they had black farmers that were in that area.
Well, we went through all of this, and I mentioned that he was the co-founder or chairman of the Compton Black Panthers, and many of the Black Panthers I've met recently this year, I was going to do a film about them, and I realized they're all so progressive in 2015 that I had to take a look at them. That's the purpose for this show. The name of the show, again, is Echoes of Blackness. I am Michael Blaze. You can catch us on these stations. Jeremy is going to be leaving town, and we're here at Skidrow Studios, as you can see up here. Jeremy will be out of town for a while, so we'll have to postpone this. But the next time we come back, we'll have Mr. Henry Hank Jones.
All right.
Yeah, and so this has really been a very exciting show. We really appreciate Robert coming on. Needless to say, he'll have to come back. I told him to take his time with this history, and this was really fantastic. So again, this is Michael Blaze. You can excuse me. You can go to Skidrow Studios and you can take a look at this show. It's also be on YouTube and other places like that, and it'll also be on iTunes. Subscribe on iTunes. Okay. Any last words, Jeremy, or am I done?
You're good.
All right. Blaze out.